So, we just found out the news that Star Wars Starfighter has finished filming, and the reaction from Star Wars fans was one of surprise. A new Star Wars movie has finished principal photography, and there were no issues, no problems, no delays. That's a miracle.
Lord, it's a miracle!
And the reason most of us had this response is because of how chaotic previous productions have been. Maybe not for The Mandalorian and Grogu, but definitely in the 2010s for the two spin-off movies, Solo: A Star Wars Story and Rogue One. And even though we're nearly 10 years on from that film, information about it is still coming out. Recently we heard from Gary Whitta, who was put off Star Wars after working on Rogue One, and now we have comments from Mads Mikkelsen, Galen Erso, who just provided us another crucial piece of the puzzle as to what went down with the original version of Rogue. Now he admits, despite production hell, it wasn't too bad for his character, because he knew Galen's arc, where he started and where he was going to finish. But Mads reveals it was most difficult for the two young heroes, Felicity Jones's Jyn Erso and Diego Luna's Cassian Andor, because in the original version of the script, they survived. And it turns out, what we call the original version of the script is actually a muddled mess of various drafts until Tony Gilroy stepped in for the reshoots. Remember guys, Tony changed everything about this film. And now Mads Mikkelsen says this: I don't think they ever locked in a draft. I think they kept working on it, which was kind of livable for a character like mine. I had my mission and I knew exactly what it was, but it was obviously tricky for the two young heroes, not knowing exactly what they were carrying into a room of baggage. And he says there was no story, there was no direction, and the scripts were, and I quote, surprisingly unfinished. And this is why there are so many deleted scenes, so much unused footage from the movie. So imagine them filming all of their scenes, being close to the end of production, and still not knowing how the movie is going to end. So Tony Gilroy was a real saviour. And Alan Tudyk, who played K2SO, expressed a very similar sentiment, saying at times they didn't know where the story was going, but they were just piecing it together scene by scene, hoping it would be coherent and make sense. And I know this year we're talking about the 10th anniversary of The Force Awakens, but it's also the 9th anniversary of Rogue One. And while I'm eternally grateful for the film and the Andor show, the hellish nature of the production process cannot be overstated. Not for the TV show, I'm talking about the movie. So for it to have come together as well as it did, and to be considered the best Star Wars movie of the Disney era, is no small feat. That is literally a miracle. And Mads Mikkelsen is being polite. He's not going all in on the specifics, but even from these brief comments you can tell he's holding back. And maybe one day we'll learn the full extent of what went down on the set. What was so bad that made people like Gary Whitta want to quit Star Wars altogether? And I always think back to the book written by Maureen Ryan, Burn It Down, Power, Complicity and a Call for Change in Hollywood, where she exposed not just Lucasfilm but other studios for the dysfunction and poor communication on sets between creatives and studios. And speaking of this, that brings us on to our next topic. Now, a lot of this is just speculative, but it has come up again. So I want you to think back to a month ago. The biggest Star Wars news topic that everyone was talking about was Leslye Headland's reflections on the Acolyte's cancellation. If you remember, she spoke about the influence of Star Wars YouTubers, how content creators have a bigger voice these days, and she gave her take on online fandom culture. She spoke about YouTube, Patreon, and the soundbites that was most surprising in her admission was coming to terms with the way The Acolyte ended, and understands that while she would have liked a season 2, that's just business. But there was another comment she made that went under the radar, and there's a very strong implication that I don't think many people picked up on. She talks about the surprise that Lucasfilm made the show's cancellation public, because usually they're so silent about these kinds of things. But in there, it's also implied that she wasn't actually told by Lucasfilm or Disney themselves that the show was cancelled. That maybe, and again, just an interpretation of her comments, she found out through indirect sources. That's what's strongly implied. Not through a representative of Disney or Lucasfilm, saying she was surprised how swift and public the cancellation was. And she goes on to confess the only phone calls she received were from concerned friends. It's not until you read between the lines that you realize that there's a very strong chance neither Disney nor Lucasfilm reached out to her in advance. She literally found out through Deadline's original scoop on August 19, 2024. Around that same time, Leslye is on record saying she was taking time away from Star Wars, trying to avoid the immediate online discourse following The Acolyte, but it's only when she saw the quote, weather report, that she realized the show was cancelled and the reason was the viewership. And in addition to this, it was well over budget. Leslye now says she realized that the viewership didn't just have to compete with the current charts, but also overall Star Wars viewership on Disney+. And The Acolyte didn't hold a candle to the likes of The Mandalorian. But she says, and I quote, "I was surprised by the way it was handled." And if you're thinking, like I did for a moment, well surely Lucasfilm wouldn't just ghost her like this and not tell her before Alan Bergman revealed it to the world. Please note that this is just one example of a consistent pattern of terrible Lucasfilm communication with their own creatives. If you think their marketing is bad and their communication with the fandom is pretty poor, it's even worse when it comes to those commissioned to make projects. To illustrate this point, and by coincidence, only days before the announcement that The Acolyte was not being renewed for a second season, the original director of the Lando series, Justin Simien, opened up about the heartbreaking process of finding out he was no longer involved in the project. He had originally been in charge of the Solo spin-off that was announced in 2020 at Disney Investor Day, but since the project became a movie and was handed over to Donald Glover, who plays Lando Calrissian, and his brother Steven. But Justin was dropped from Lando in the most unceremonious of ways. He found out like the rest of us, and to this day is still gobsmacked there was such little communication. And we're not just talking about being a little bit sad. He says he went through a literal grieving process. Now, I'm not gonna lie to you. The idea of a Donald Glover movie with his brother Steven is far more exciting to me. I know he's had some major issues with his health as of late, but I think that's as close as we're gonna get to a Solo 2. But what I'm saying is, despite how I might feel about certain creatives and their shows and their films, big studios like Lucasfilm should still inform them when they're no longer employed. I mean, in this day and age, there is no excuse for it. And you don't even have to go as far as the Lando project to see this. Even within the scope of The Acolyte, a comparable situation happened to producer Karen McCarthy, who sued Lucasfilm for a sudden and egregious axing. But despite everything that went down, Headland notes that she has no regrets and is still, quote, absolutely obsessed with the Star Wars universe. And then she goes on to say, and honestly, the designers that worked on the show are more responsible for it than I am. Because of what Star Wars is, creating that world is harder than creating the narrative and the dialogue and the characters. It's more about hiring the right people, and those people were brilliant, she says. So, a few additional comments there from Leslye, and honestly it reminds me of what Rian Johnson recently said, reflecting on his movie The Last Jedi after 8 years. He knows it was divisive and it was controversial, but he has no regrets. He stands by his story and the themes he explored. And look, I'm not a fan of either project. I know some fans expect an apology from these creatives, but what do you expect them to say? Oh yes, I made this horrible work of art, what was I thinking? If you're gonna make something that people despise, at least stand by it, that's all I'm saying.
At least stand by your dump.
I disagree with so many choices in both projects, and they're not entirely separate. I know one is pre-Phantom Menace and one is sequel trilogy, but we know Leslye Headland was inspired by Rian Johnson's portrayal of the Jedi. But I've always found Lucasfilm's relationship with their creatives a bit of an enigma. There are many instances where creatives walk away from the project for logical reasons. Delays and even creative clashes are pretty common in Hollywood. But then there are cases like this, where you have to wonder why didn't Lucasfilm contact them? And to finish on a more positive note, I wonder if they're going to do anything special for Rogue One's 10th anniversary. Thanks to Andor, the movie is as popular as ever, and I hope we get something of a re-release. And if they do it, I hope in some way, shape or form they give a shout out to Andor, maybe incorporating some scenes at the beginning, or teasing the show at the end, which I think, if I'm not mistaken, Tony Gilroy said Lucasfilm might consider. But with all of that said, my friends, share your thoughts in the comments down below.